Welcome everyone. I'm so excited to host today. As Joe mentioned, I am director at Reach the World, which is a nonprofit partner for this event. The Explorers Club as well is another organization partnering for this amazing festival. This festival is so special, tied to the UN Day to celebrate women and girls in science. And really it made me wonder, why do we need to have a day to celebrate women and girls in science? Well, here's why. Here are some statistics. Worldwide, women represent only 28% of the workforce in STEM, STEM being science, technology, engineering, and math. 28%. There's like 51% of us. And even when they get jobs within STEM fields, those women are making an average of $15,000 less than men. Black and Latina women in STEM earn around $33,000 less. It's unfair and it's not a new problem. And I'm sure you've seen examples too. Do you ever read textbooks and wonder, why are there only men in this book? Or isn't it odd that all the US presidents were men? Or all the CEOs of big companies were men? Or that almost all of the explorers that you study in school who've been credited with all of those big discoveries, they're all men too? Well, our guest today asked those questions and she went a step further. And she just made the discoveries of women explorers that the history textbooks have left out. She then wrote her own book on women explorers. It's my pleasure to introduce Milbry Polk. So I'm going to bring Milbry in and say hi. Hello, Milbry.
Hi. I guess at this point I do the screen share, right?
No, we're going to introduce everyone first. I want to introduce you. I want everyone to see you, and I want everyone to know about a little bit about your life. At age 23, Milbry spent 2 months crossing Egypt's western desert on camelback to retrace Alexander the Great's journey. She has had an amazing career as a photojournalist, and she's investigated stories of women explorers. She wrote the book on women in exploration, and today she's here to share some of those stories with us. I'm also going to bring in Lacey Flint so that we can see Lacey. Hi, Lacey.
Hi, everybody.
So we're also going to hear from Lacey Flint. She is the archivist and curator of research collections at the Explorers Club. She will guide us through the history of women's involvement in the Explorers Club. But before we even get started with the talk, I'm going to do something really fun and a little bit different. We've actually invited a teacher to join us with her class. So Christine Neely is a fellow at the Explorers Club as well. She's also a lower school science teacher in New York City who's brought 10 classrooms along this journey today with us. So I'm going to bring in Christine. Hi, Christine. Hi, so you're on mute there. Okay.
Hi, how are you? Nice to see everybody.
Great. Could you kick it off? Tell us a little bit about who's joining us today. Who are your students?
I have students in grades 2 through 4 at an independent school in New York City, Trinity School. Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, I know that they are going to be joining us on the stream, so thank you so much for joining us. And if they have any questions, you can jump on in and interrupt our conversation and field those questions for your students. And we're going to get started here. I am going to let Milbry take it away. So let's get started. Thank you, Milbry. You can go ahead and share your screen.
There. Is that working?
It's working great.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much for having me today. I'm really looking forward to this new experience of talking to people through computers. Today I'm going to tell you a little bit about my journey as an explorer and then introduce you to 4 women explorers who lived quite a while ago. But first, I want to talk to you about who is an explorer. And I'll tell you right now, I'm not going to read the screens, so I hope that you all read the screens while I'm talking. Explorers are people with a purpose who go where they must to find answers. And exploration is about knowledge. Exploration is a quest that will never end. Being an explorer is the essence of being human. They are people with curiosity about the world. They're people that take chances and accept failure. And that's a very important thing. Failure is not always bad. Explorers are people who understand their own limits and yet continuously push their boundaries. They have courage to face the physical world and hold beliefs about it not generally accepted. They're people who want to engage with the world. They can communicate and want to share their discoveries with others. They find connections. They can be everyone, and they should be you. By embracing the principles of exploration, curiosity, knowledge, courage, it will lead you to a fascinating life. Since I was young, I loved reading stories. Some of the first inspirational stories I read were by a man named Tolkien. He invented a mythical world. He even invented the languages people of that world spoke. And if you haven't had a chance, I would advise you all to read his first book, The Hobbit. But I was also interested to read about people who lived long ago. I was fascinated by their clothes, their houses, their jewelry, their legends. Their lives were so very different than anything I knew. There was one person who lived a long time ago whose story fascinated me. He was Alexander the Great. He lived more than 2,500 years ago. When he was about 20, he left his Greek homeland at the head of a large army. His goal was to conquer the world as they knew it then, and he did. He went on all the way to India on horseback. All along his route to this day, there are many towns and cities named Alexandria for him. And this is the map of his empire. You can see what a large piece of the world he actually controlled.
Milbry, do you
Sorry?
play on the slideshow?
Can I do what?
Can you press play on the slideshow?
Press play. It's full of it's not moving forward?
It's not moving forward. If you can test it.
Press play.
It's on just above the word great.
Yeah, I did. Okay, play. You see that?
Okay, it's not working. How about up at the top, if you go File, View, or if you go View, Enter Full Screen?
Sorry. It's moving forward on my computer.
Maybe another thing you could do is click the Format button over on the right side, just above that black square. That'll get rid of the format.
Do you want to do it from your computer?
Yeah, I can launch it here.
I just don't know how to do this any better.
No problem. I will share the presentation here. And we can get started with
Alexander
the Great. And we can see it there.
Okay, so we can move to the next one, and that shows his empire. And then the next one is I was growing up in Egypt, and it's a wonderful place full of ancient history. And the next one, you'll see me when I was fairly young, photographing in the tombs of the pharaohs of Egypt. And the next one, Alexander had also conquered Egypt. So I decided that when I was old enough, I would follow his trail like he did, on camelback, across the trackless sands of the western desert to see if I could find any trace of his passing. When I was 23, that's what I did. For 2 months, I walked across the deserts with my camels. I quickly learned that unlike horses, camels are not easy to ride as their gait is so uncomfortable, so we walked. The next one, and that adventure led to other ones. And by then I'd become a photojournalist, writing and photographing. The next one. And some of my stories were about mud brick architecture of Yemen, rock carvings in Saudi Arabia, the hill tribes of Pakistan, and many other places, and I learned to be a guide in the wilderness of Alaska, the next one. And I've written several books, next one, inspired by exploration, and there you can see some of the titles. And one day someone asked me if because I was a woman, if I was afraid, not just because of the wild places I was going, but because I was a woman. I'd never thought about that before. The next one. And that question made me wonder where the other women like me were. I'd never really met any. And that started me on another type of exploration into history. I, of course, had been reading a lot about exploration in history all my life, and I realized that I rarely, if ever, read stories about women explorers. There had to be some other women like me. I began reading the history books, starting with looking at the footnotes and bibliographies, and slowly building up my library of books that had references to women explorers, and then finally finding books that were written by women themselves. I now have about 1,200 books, and I know that there are many, many more. And I've written my own book, which you just see right here, where I picked out about 90 stories that really interested me. What I found was that, of course, women were exploring the world. They always have. It's just that their stories are not always easy to find. You have to really look. What I've come to realize is that everyone, no matter your gender, race, culture, is an explorer. It's in our genes. It's what makes us human. We're all interested in what is beyond the next valley or over the hill, what creatures share the earth with us, how it all works. Looking for answers for our own individual questions about life is what propels each of us forward to learn and understand. It's exciting, and each of us is on a quest, the quest of our life. Next one. And now I'm going to tell you briefly the stories of four women. Um, Gudrid, the next one, the far traveler, was a remarkable woman and probably one of the most traveled women of her time. She lived in Iceland around 1,000 years ago. That's why we only have a statue of her. There are no paintings or any other depictions of what she looked like. During her life, she traveled from Iceland to Greenland, on to Newfoundland, back to Iceland, to Norway, to Europe, to Rome, and back to Iceland. That was a very unusual travel for her day. Next one. This this map, if you can see it, shows what the North Sea area when she was living, where she was traveling. You can see Norway up here, you can see Greenland, you can see Iceland, and you can see the coast of North America over here. And how did they do that? Because they didn't have motorboats then, they didn't even have compasses. The next slide shows you how they did it. They followed the currents, and the currents that move around in the sea took them exactly to all those places where she lived and traveled. So that was pretty amazing. And we know about her because the next slide shows that in Iceland, they wrote sagas, and sagas were the histories of the earliest people in Iceland. And two of those sagas talk about Gudrid's journeys. And we know also where her homes were. This next one shows a reconstruction of her house in Iceland. And the next slide are the ruins of her house in Greenland. And then the next slide shows where she lived in Newfoundland in North America. And this site was discovered by another woman explorer named Anne Stein Ingstad. Gudrid was also a pilgrim. That was one way women could travel and still can travel today. Religions often consider it very important for people to visit holy sites. Next slide. Gudrid was born a pagan and converted later in life to Christianity. The trip to Rome, the center of learning, was an important step for her to take. She had to take a boat from Iceland to Denmark and then walk all the way from Denmark down to Rome, all across Europe. And this map shows, this is a modern version of the pilgrim map showing how you get there and all the places you can stay along the way. There are hints that she met with Pope Johannes. Next slide. At the time, if this is true, then she would probably be the first person to take the news of the New World to the center of learning in the West. And remember, this is 1000 AD, 500 years before Columbus. And Gudrid had not only been to the New World, to North America, she'd lived there and given birth to a son there. She had encounters with Native Americans, probably the Beothuk peoples. She had survived shipwreck and other great dangers. It would be amazing to find in the Vatican Library some record of that meeting. Maybe one of you will one day find that record. And after Rome, next slide, probably with the Pope's blessing, she returned to Iceland and built an abbey where she lived out the rest of her days. Another area that women had to strive to overcome was lack of education. Many times in history and in many cultures, people felt that women only needed to know as much as they needed to run a household or help their husbands. But in the 1800s, many new scientific fields were being established, like geology and botany. Women were thought smart enough and useful enough to collect, but not to publish their discoveries. There are many examples of women who were working all over the world, painting, collecting, identifying, and building up the basis of many scientific fields. One example, the next one, is Mary Kingsley. Her father was a doctor. You can switch the slide. And an explorer, and her uncle was a famous novelist. She was raised to take care of her parents. Her father allowed her to study German so she could translate articles for him, but that was it for formal education. Luckily, he was gone a lot, and she found the key to his library and educated herself in his absence. When he died, her brother said she could come live with him and take care of his house as she'd done for their father. She said no, and took her small inheritance and bought a ticket to the farthest place she could sail to. It was a place white women, unless they were wives of missionaries, just did not go. It was West Africa. You can see here on the map, this is a map of West Africa. She settled on the Gabon. Before she left, she got a small commission from the British Museum to collect fish. She would discover a number of unknown species, and some of which are named for her, including the one in the bottom right of the picture. Next picture. Once she reached the Ogowé River, she got a canoe, stocked some provisions, and set herself up as a trader on the river, collecting her fish and studying local religions. She wrote a delightful book about her adventures, which is still in print. She called it The Blessings of a Good Thick Skirt. The title of her book comes from a fall she had into an elephant trap, and that was a pit lined with poisoned snakes. She was saved by her thick skirts, which prevented her skin being pierced. She decided to travel in the Victorian costume, including the lucky skirts, corsets, which must have been very uncomfortable, and hats, because she wanted to honor the people with whom she would travel and live. When she returned from her first trip, she was a sensation, and she traveled all over England giving lectures about her journey. Her book was a great success, and she returned to Africa to write another book. By this time, she was learning the languages, and that's another area where women excelled. They were dependent upon the people, as they often traveled alone, and so they became a bridge between two different worlds. On her last trip, Kingsley volunteered to be a nurse in the Boer War in South Africa, treating prisoners. Sadly, she got sick and died and was buried at sea. Luckily, her books live on. One role that's totally overlooked and sadly often lost is the role Indigenous women played in aiding explorers. Of course, many are not even named. A Chippewayan woman was instrumental in John Franklin's overland expedition up the Coppermine River in 1819, that's in northern Canada, called one of the most harrowing overland journeys in Arctic history. But Franklin only calls the woman responsible for saving his life Greenstockings. But one story we do know, because the explorer wrote about it, and unusually for the time, gave credit to the woman who many times over saved his life. Her name was Tukalittuk, also called Hannah by the British and the American explorers. She was born at Cape Cyril, next slide, in Cumberland Sound on Baffin Island. You can see the arrow points to where she was born up here in northern Canada. Her central story takes place almost entirely at sea on an ice floe, the nearly tragic end of Captain Hall's Polaris expedition. But before we get to that, I want to mention a little bit about her life before then. Next slide. Her family were known as hunters, guides, and translators, and much prize to go on expeditions. Her brother, Inuluapik, traveled with whaler William Penny to Aberdeen, Scotland in 1839, and is one of the only Inuit known at that time to have written his own memoirs. Her mother was known for her map-making abilities, and other siblings also aided explorers and whalers. The next slide. In 1853, a whaling captain named John Bowlby took her to England, where she was exhibited like a zoo display throughout the north of the country, and later she met Queen Victoria at Windsor Castle. She also learned English. At that time, many different indigenous peoples were brought to Europe and displayed. They did not have television, and this was the way Europeans were introduced to different ways of humans lived around the world. And then Bowlby, unusual for the time, returned to Galitu and her husband, Joe, and this other child who was not her child, back to the Arctic. And that's when she met Charles Francis Hall. Next slide. Hall's plan, unusual for the time, was to live alone with and learn from the Inuit. And this is one reason we know so much about her. After several expeditions, including one looking for the relics, the next slide, of an expedition of the 1500s, next slide, of Frobisher on northern Baffin Island, they planned their third expedition, next slide, to go to the North Pole, which at that time was the goal of so many explorers. They left from New York City in 1871, bound for northern Greenland. So you can see up here, they went all the way up to the top up to Greenland. It was not a happy trip. There was a lot of fighting on board the ship. And in fact, by the fall, Hall was poisoned to death. We don't know who did it. And in the spring, they finally were able to return home. But the ship was caught in a terrible storm. The next slide. It was rocked and squeezed between huge ice floes. Some crew jumped onto the ice to collect the food and equipment that was being tossed overboard when the sailors feared the ship was about to sink. Suddenly, the ship separated from the ice and disappeared into the storm, stranding 2 Inuit families, including 5 children, 7 German crew members, the African-American cook, and an English steward, 19 people in all, on the ice. In one of the greatest survival stories ever, the party survived for 6 months on a series of increasingly shrinking ice floes until all of its members, the next slide, were finally rescued in April. There they all are. All of them survived that, off the coast of Labrador. They had floated on the ice for 1,500 miles. After they were rescued, next slide, Tukalituk traveled to Washington, D.C., where she testified about the expedition in Congress. But since Hall was dead, she would never be able to return to the Arctic, and she was buried in Connecticut. I will end with a story about a woman I found in a footnote. Growing up, I loved the stories about explorers who searched for the source of the Nile. Sir Richard Burton was a great favorite. So was Baker, who found the source. And incredibly, Baker's expedition was led by his wife because Baker was sick most of the time, and his wife was a woman he bought in a slave market. But it was the footnote in a history book that mentioned another woman, Alexandrine Tine, a Dutch woman who led an expedition of women to search for the Nile source. Next slide. In 1861, an unusual camel caravan was making its way across the harsh deserts of the Sudan. It was led by the 26-year-old woman and included her mother, her aunt, their maids and servants, 102 camels carrying silver, musical instruments, a library, food, wine, scientific gear, in short, everything they thought they would need for a long stay in the swamp. That's a lot of stuff to carry on an expedition. They were headed towards Khartoum, the staging area for expeditions up the Nile. There she would encounter the best-known explorers of her day, Livingston, Burton, Speke, and Baker, none of whom were pleased to see her because Tine had rented the only barge that was capable of taking people into the swamp. Next slide. They spent 3 years in the swamp, and Tine made a large collection of botanicals and eventually housed in Vienna, and an ethnographic collection that was housed in Liverpool. Sadly, both collections were bombed during World War II, but what we have from her are her written reports that survived at the Royal Geographic Society. She also, unusually, worked to free all the slaves she encountered in the Sudan, even buying dozens of them. Many attached themselves to her, and upon her return to Cairo, she had a household of former slaves which she educated and found jobs for. But she paid a terrible price. Her mother, aunt, and maids died in the swamp. She sent their bodies back to Holland, a trip she would never make. In 1867, next slide, she left for Algiers to plan another expedition to Timbuktu. In 1869, she sadly was murdered in the desert by tribesmen who thought that her big casks contained gold. In fact, they contained water, which ironically in the desert is more valuable than gold. Why don't we know about her? Historically, women explored differently than men. They usually did not have sponsors, so they didn't have to produce results. And they meandered, learned languages, and lived with the distant peoples. And well into the 20th century, many academic societies, clubs, colleges, and universities were run by men, and they excluded women. I've just begun the process of discovering these little-known stories of women explorers. There's so much more to learn, and I'm sure there's a lot more each of you can contribute to this story. I like to think of our Earth as a raft in the sea of universe. Like oceans, you have to take care of the raft so it won't sink with you on it. And our changing world needs explorers. You will be the ones to guide us forward into the future. Each of you is an explorer, and embrace it. Start your journey now. Trust yourself. Never stop dreaming, and dream big. Find your passion, and your passion is the thing that makes you get up in the morning, to get out of bed and be really excited about the day. So what's there left to explore? The answer is everything. And here are some words that I like to think of as a mantra. We're all part of the exploration adventure. So say these words together with me. Inspire, inform, share, challenge, ask questions, enjoy, engage, discover, be curious, find solutions. This will guide you as you move forward in your education. I'll leave you now and turn to Lacey, who is the archivist of the Explorers Club. We'll find out about more women explorers who lived more recently. We're all on our own paths of discovery. Thank you. I can't hear you.
Here. Oh, now you can hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Great. Wow. Thank you, Milbry. I really have so much gratitude that you went out and you found these stories. And some of them they're inspiring, and some of them are quite tragic too. And but to be able to tell them is we can rewrite history now. And so thank you for dedicating your work and your career to doing this.
Thank you. There's lots more stories out there, and I challenge everybody listening to this to find some.
That's great. Well, we're going to bring in Lacey now, and maybe first we'll see if there's any questions from the classroom. So I'm going to bring in Christine and unmute you here. Christine, do you have anything that you want to ask for your students?
Yeah, my students, actually, I have a student, Zoe, in third grade, would like to know, how did you go to school in the desert in Egypt?
Oh, well, I did my expeditions when on vacation. So I was going to boarding school. I went to boarding schools most of my life because my parents lived in faraway places.
All right. And then I have another one from Emmett. Emmett, also in third grade, would like to know, and this is a quote from Emmett, "You're an explorer like Indiana Jones. And in the movies, he's afraid of snakes. What do you do when you encounter something like a creature you're afraid of in the wild?"
Well, when I was in the desert, the thing I was really scared of were scorpions, because there were lots of scorpions. And scorpions like to go places that are warm. And at night, we slept on the sand. And so I would have a mat and then a blanket. and I slept next to my camel because it was warm. It's actually very cold in the desert at night. But in the morning, I would take my shoes and shake them really hard just to make sure that there were no scorpions that had gone into the shoe. So that's what I did. But you have to be careful because there's snakes, and the snakes are the same color as sand.
All right. We have another one also in the 4th grade from Dash. You've been to so many exciting places on Earth. Are you interested in exploring outer space if and when that becomes more available?
I would love to, but I think I'm too old. I think that's something for all of you that are listening. I think that there's going to be a place for you to go to Mars or go back to the moon. It's so exciting what's going to be possible with new technology.
Yeah, and I think we have a few talks. I know we had one earlier this morning on space and women in space, and we have more coming up this weekend and throughout the year with our celebrations. So there's lots of opportunities for that next generation to get to space.
Absolutely.
All right, maybe Christine, if you have one more, and then we'll hand it over to Lacey.
Yeah, we've got, let's see. Oh, how many languages do you read or speak? And did you learn them growing up, or did you learn them for different projects? That's from Maya.
Oh, I wish that I were better at languages. I really only have 2.5 languages because I never stayed very long myself. What my exploration has been more recently has been into history books. And so I talk about people that really lived in a place and learned those languages. Language is a terribly important thing to learn. And I really advise all of you to pick a language and really learn it, because it's so important to be able to communicate with people like in their own language.
Definitely. Well, great. Thank you, Milbry. And we'll bring Lacey into the stream. Hi, Lacey.
Hello.
How are you doing today?
I'm really good. I'm so excited to be here. Thank you so much to Joe and, of course, Brianna for hosting. We're so excited to be here and, talk about women in exploration and just exploration in general. So thank you.
Great. And it looks like we're matching today, Lacey.
We are matching, yes. Great minds think alike.
Exactly. So you are the curator at the Explorers Club. So you take care of Explorers stuff. I've heard you say that before.
That's absolutely true. Yes.
And you know the history, and it's a bit of a tricky history because the Explorers Club didn't let women into the club until 1981. That was only 40 years ago. So can you talk a little bit about that? And can you tell us, the problems there? And that's an example of women being excluded from STEM and STEM fields and science in general. And, we've come a long way since then. So I'm excited to pass it over to you and share the history a little bit there.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, it is. It's, the interesting thing about history is it's not always easy, right? It kind of depends on who's telling the story and the history that you're getting. And so when the Explorers Club was founded, we didn't include women. And I'm going to share my screen here so you guys can see what we got going on. All righty. So here we have, we're going to talk about the Explorers Club. So if we were all together in person, which I so wish we were, and I really hope one day that all of you will come visit me at the Explorers Club when we're back there. But if we were together, I would say, well, what does it mean to be an explorer, and who are explorers, and what kind of qualities or traits do explorers have? And so I'm going to ask you to think about that. What types of characteristics do you think explorers have? Are they brave? Are they educated? Are they curious? And so think about that and think about some of the characteristics that you have. Are you brave? Are you going to school and learning as much as you can? Are you curious? And the really exciting thing about exploration is that we define it as curiosity in action here at the Explorers Club. And so what that means is you have a question, you go out and find the answer and let us know what that's all about. And so obviously, that does not just apply to men. However, when the club was first founded, those are the only people who could be in the club. So part of my job, as Brianna said, is I take care of all of this stuff, right? I'm not necessarily an explorer myself, but I get to take care of all of their really cool stuff. So to the person who asked about Indiana Jones, right, and said Milbry was like Indiana Jones, in my collection, I have the bullwhip that belonged to Roy Chapman Andrews, who was the real life inspiration for Indiana Jones. So I really hope you guys can come visit me one day when it's safe to do so and when we're all back. So part of taking care of all of this stuff, right, is I don't just have artifacts, which is all of the objects. I also have paper and documents and photographs. So I'm going to share some of those things with you. And one of the things I'm going to share first is if you look here, this is an excerpt from a document, and this document here is from our certificate of incorporation, which basically means this is the document that said, okay, you can be the Explorers Club, here you are. So this was drafted and signed in 1905. And if you look down here at number 4, in the reasons why the club was formed, it says to encourage explorers in their work by evincing interest and sympathy, and especially by bringing them in personal contact and binding them in the bonds of good fellowship. Well, that sounds okay, right? We're not defining who explorers are. We can think an explorer can be anybody, right? Well, unfortunately, a week later, when the club's bylaws were adopted, which are basically the rules that the club has to follow, it says persons eligible for active membership shall be men. But do we think that means women were not part of the story? Absolutely not. So what we're going to do today is talk about women and their involvement with the Explorers Club before they could become members. So as I said, the club was founded in 1905, and we were founded by 7 Arctic explorers. And essentially they came together and said, well, wait a second. There's a lot more to explore than just the Arctic, right? So their ideas became the foundation of our mission, which today is to explore land, sea, air, and space. And guess what? Men and women have been in all of those places, right? And so we're going to talk about, to start off, we're going to talk about some of the women because we were founded by Arctic explorers. We're going to talk about some of the Arctic women who were on these explorations with their husbands. And sometimes we call them the polar wives, right? So Matthew Henson and Robert Peary were the first 2 people to get to the North Pole in 1909, and they brought with them 4 Inuit guides. And Robert Peary's wife, Josephine Peary, was an amazing explorer in her own right. She went on 6 expeditions with him, and this is her right here. You can see her in her full Arctic gear and getup. She was a scientist. She was a journalist, right? She was an author sharing her publications and her work. So she wrote a lot of books about her time in the Arctic and what she was learning and really the science that she was contributing to the expeditions. And I point out this one here with this little baby, this book called The Snow Baby. Josephine Peary wrote this because she was a brand new mom in the Arctic on one of her expeditions. She had her baby in Greenland, which is kind of amazing to think about, right? So this is Marie Peary was her name, and she was born in Greenland. She was born on an Arctic expedition. Now, women played a really important part on these expeditions, especially these early polar expeditions, because not only were they really, did they play a really big role in publicizing them and getting the word out, but they also defended the expeditions. And a lot of times they also helped with funding. Then we'll move over here to, this is Eva Nansen right here. And not only was she a very accomplished opera singer, but she was the wife of Fridtjof Nansen, who was an Arctic explorer. And together you can see her here in this ski suit. She was the first woman to ski across the Hardanger Plateau, which is in Norway. And she did that in 1892. And so she got a lot of praise for doing that, for being, really incredible in this pioneering skier. But unfortunately, again, we talk about sometimes history being a little tough. Unfortunately, she also got criticized for her outfit. Some people thought it wasn't appropriate for her to be skiing in a dress, which is kind of crazy. I mean, I don't know that I would want to ski in a dress today because it's probably a little bit cold, but that's what she wore. And guess what? You can wear, that was the gear that she had. So that's what she had to do. And we could go on and on and on about these polar women and all of these women who accompanied their husbands on their expeditions, right? One of them, her name is Jackie Roney, and she was the first woman to be a working member of an Antarctic expedition, and that was in 1947. So she's pretty cool too. There's a ton of them. But now we'll talk about kind of women at the club, right? Because none of those polar wives had actually ever been to the club, unfortunately. But these women that we're going to talk about next were there. So when the club was founded, and very similar to what we do today, like what we're doing right now, coming to you guys, in your classrooms, events and lectures were held and are held at the club to acknowledge the accomplishments of a particular explorer, right? Because what's the point of exploration if you're not going to share your findings? That's one of the biggest and most important things about being an explorer, is sharing what you find. So that way you can continue to build on that, or other people can continue to build on that and explore and find more. So the club hosted, remember, we were founded in 1905. By 1912, we had our first woman speaker, and that's this lady right here. And her name is Ethel Brilliana Tweedy. But when she was publishing her books, she published them under her husband's name. So she was Mrs. Alec Tweedy. And this is one of her books, A Girl's Ride in Iceland. Now, Ethel Tweedy was incredible. She was really, really independent. Unfortunately, her husband passed away unexpectedly in 1896, and that left her to explore on her own. And she did that. She didn't let that death stop him. Of course, she was heartbroken, but she continued her work, and she published dozens and dozens and dozens of books, kind of just like Milbry, who has published dozens of books on exploration. And so she came and spoke at the club, and it was so popular that they continued these ladies' nights and having women explorers come and speak. So another one who's really, really cool is this lady right here, Mabel Cook Cole. And you can see her, she's in the Philippines right now. That's her husband, Fay Cooper Cole. And they were anthropologists. And so anthropologists study cultures. They study languages. They study other cultures. They study human interaction, that kind of thing. And what Mabel Cook Cole was really interested in was bringing back folk tales and stories and oral history. So this here is one of the books that she published called Philippine Folk Tales. Which was really, really popular. People loved it because it was something so different than they had seen. So continuing on to ladies' night, some other really interesting ladies who spoke. This lady here, this is Harriet Chalmers Adams. She was an absolutely incredible pioneering explorer. She was a Nat Geo photographer. She was a war correspondent. And this photo right here, she actually took this photo, and it was published in the National Geographic magazine in June of 1921. And it's the Grand Canyon Bridge. So they're actually building that in this photo. So she spoke at the club in 1925. But unfortunately, remember, history can be tough. The Explorers Club decided to exclude women a little bit more. And rather than inviting them all the time, they said ladies can only come twice a year. And so that really limited women who could speak at the club. But what Harriet Chalmers Adams did was said, well, I'm going to speak at the Explorers Club, but then I'm also going to help start up our own society, right? And so she was one of the founders of what was called the Society of Women Geographers. And together, all of these women got together and said, well, we're explorers too, so we're going to have our own club and talk about these things. And the Society of Women Geographers still exists today. They have a lot of parallels with the Explorers Club. There's a lot of crossover. We have a lot of members who are members of both the Society of Women Geographers and the Explorers Club. And they used to meet at the Explorers Club before women could become members. So, the men of the Explorers Club were sort of getting the women's perspective on exploration, apparently, by engaging with the Society of Women Geographers. Another really cool explorer who came and spoke at the club was Mary Jobe Akeley. You can see her here. She's got her camera. And this is her in the Congo. So Mary Akeley was so well-rounded. She had a lot of exploration credits. She was a pioneering mountaineer. But when she married her husband, Carl Akeley, she actually decided to not necessarily give up that part of exploration, but she broadened her exploration horizons and went with him to the Congo, where together they helped sort of create all of these exhibits at the Museum of Natural History. Has everyone here, or I hope a lot of you have been to the American Museum of Natural History in New York City and seen the Akeley Hall of African Mammals, where all of those dioramas are, right? You see the gorillas, there's the elephant group. You can see all of those animals. in real life, right? And so Mary Akeley and her husband Carl were actually the people responsible for creating those dioramas. And after Carl Akeley died, it was Mary Jobe Akeley who worked with the Museum of Natural History to help continue creating those dioramas. Now, of course, taxidermy and that type of study for animals is not at all what we do anymore. And Mary Jobe Akeley actually knew that, and she became a pioneer in conservation, and she was a crusader for establishing game preserves, and she really worked to save a lot of endangered species in Africa. Then we get to 1932, and this lady right here, some of you may recognize. I know it's probably a little hard to see because the photo is really light, but this is Amelia Earhart, right? And so Amelia Earhart was married to a gentleman by the name of Charles Palmer Putnam, and he is this guy right here. And he was a member of the Explorers Club. He was a president of the Explorers Club. And she kind of said, well, wait a second. I'm on all these expeditions. I'm going out on my own. I'm an explorer in my own right. How come I can't be a member of the Explorers Club? And so the club founded what was called the Honorary Roll of Women, which meant women could be a part of the club, sort of, but not an official member. And here you see her. This is the Explorers Club flag. And it's a really big honor to carry the flag. We have members who have carried the flag to the moon, to the deepest point of the ocean, this flag was going with Richard Byrd, and that's him right there. Richard Byrd was the first person to fly a plane over the South Pole, among a lot of other different things. And so here she is in this photo with the Explorers Club flag. Unfortunately, she wasn't allowed to carry it herself because she wasn't a member, but she did get to sort of start what was called this Honorary Roll of Women. And the text that you see, this is taken out of the Explorers Club board minutes, and this is the resolution that basically the board said, we have such great admiration and respect for you because of your accomplishments and because of your courage. And so I put that in there for you guys to check out as well. And then here she is again. This is also from the archives, some of the old documents that we have. She got to host a ladies' night of her own. This is the front of the card. That's the back of the card, which invites everybody to the club. And she spoke about her work, right? She spoke about her flights. But she also was, for some reason, responsible for presenting the club with a mascot. And so she gave them a kitten. It was some type of ceremonious presentation of a mascot. So there you go. Sometimes you'll see photos of Amelia Earhart at the Explorers Club with a kitten. All right. So the other things, like I said, my job is to take care of the stuff of the explorers, right, that they bring back. And so I'm going to show you some really cool maps and photographs of things that are in the collection in the archives. So this is a map. And again, I know it's probably a little bit hard to see, but this is a map done by a gentleman by the name of H.F. Milne, and he was the cartographer for the Royal Geographic Society, and that's over in the UK. But here, this is actually a series of hand-drawn maps where he puts side by side the routes of 4 explorers across the Transjordan. And so you can see here, this red dotted line, that is Gertrude Bell's route. And then you've got the routes of Alwa Musil, Vivian Holt, and Henry Field. And guess what? Gertrude Bell was the only woman. And she also was really one of the first to make this route. She was exploring there in 1913 and 1914. Everybody else was either right after her or a little bit later. So she really was trailblazing in that sense. Another person I want to talk about from the archives, this is Osa Johnson, and you can see her here in the car. She was, along with her husband, that's her husband Martin, they were really popular filmmakers, and what they did was they went on safari and they filmed animals in Africa and the South Sea and South Sea tribal groups, and they brought these films back to the United States to kind of share the work that they were doing and share what was out there, right? Because today, it's much easier to go on safari than it was. They were exploring in the 1940s and 50s, and even then it wasn't so easy. And so they brought these films back. And Osa Johnson is known as the heroine of 1,000 thrills because she was so brave and such a pioneer on safari.
This is very cool. Lacey, so we have about 1 minute before we're going to do Q&A and tie up.
Perfect timing. This is the last map that I want to show everybody. And this is Marie Tharp. And she actually created this map. She and her partner were the very first people to map the seafloor of the Atlantic Ocean. And so that's what this map is. So all of these ridges, these are actually underwater mountains and fault lines and all of that. Yes, there are mountains underwater and in the ocean. And she was the first person to actually do this. And prior to that, she was the first person to actually come up with the idea of plate tectonics, although she didn't get credit for that right away. And so this is one of those really special maps in our collection, not only because Marie Tharp was one of the people who created it, but because, again, one of the really cool parts of my job is that I get to meet all of these explorers when they come in. So unfortunately, Marie Tharp has since died, but I have met Sylvia Earle on a number of occasions, and she was one of the first women explorers accepted to membership in the Explorers Club. And she was the one who told me all about this map. So I got to hear from Sylvia Earle, who is this incredible ocean explorer. Her nickname is Her Deepness. She's an aquanaut. She is a pioneering ocean explorer, and she told me all about this woman, Marie Tharp, and this map, which is pretty awesome. And then that brings us to 1981, when we finally have women as members of the club. Essentially what happened is, a woman applied to the club and she really wanted to be a member, and she refused to take her membership application away. And so that made the board of directors and the members of the club, it forced them to vote on whether or not women could become members of the club. And in 1981, they finally allowed women to become members. And this is a letter written by Carl Sagan, who's an amazing explorer. And he basically says, if membership in the Explorers Club is only restricted to men, the loss will be ours, and we're only depriving ourselves. And since then, we have opened the doors to women members, which is absolutely fantastic, of course. And even though men had about a 75 to 80 year head start in membership, women have caught up pretty quickly. Our membership roles are not quite equal. There's still more men than women, but our young members who are coming into the club are actually more women than men, which is really exciting, and just kind of proves that everybody can be an explorer. And now, thank goodness, we welcome everybody into the club.
Wow. Well, thank you, Lacey. Thank you for sharing those stories with us. And I'm going to bring everyone back into the stream because we do have a lot of questions in the chat. We actually have a lot of people tuning in. Colorado, Iceland, England, all over the place. And I just want to make sure if there are any teachers out there, you can read this great article that we have up. It's written by Milbry. It's on the Explorers, or it's on reachtheworld.org. It's part of a larger series where you can sign up with Reach the World to follow women of the Explorers Club. We'll leave that up there. And get to a couple questions from the chat. I know one in particular, there's a couple people asking Milbry, how do we get your book?
Well, it's unfortunately, it's a little dated, but the best place is Amazon. And I'm hoping to bring out a new edition at some near point that will be in paperback with new stories.
That's great. Let's see what else we have here in the chat. This one is for Lacey. How do we get involved in the Explorers Club?
Sure. You can kind of get involved in a number of ways. We have student membership begins at 16, and you might be thinking, well, what could I have explored when I'm 16? I will tell you, some of our youngest members are the people who have accomplished the most. And so what you can do is reach out to our membership team and basically tell us what you've done, tell us what you've explored. And we have different levels of membership based on the different accomplishments of different explorers.
Great. Now this one is for Milbry. Alan asks, which book are you most proud of?
Oh boy, I guess Women of Discovery, and I'm in the middle of a new book right now that's a pop-up book. It's my second pop-up book. It's on the Hajj, and the Hajj is the pilgrimage that Muslims make to Mecca, and so that's my current book, and so that I hope will be out in the next year.
Great. Now, any questions from the classrooms online with us today?
Do you have them from the chat, or would you like me to take some from my?
Yeah, from your students.
From my students. Yeah. So for Lacey, what has been the biggest challenge you faced in terms of artifact preservation?
Ooh, excellent question. One of the toughest things about the Explorers Club is that we are not a traditional museum. And so it's really important that your artifacts are at the right temperature. They're stored, in appropriate cases. And so one of the toughest things is making sure that the climate, just like, the climate outside, we want that to be kind of doing the right thing. We need the climate inside to be doing the right thing. So one of the toughest things is trying to make sure that all of our climate and temperature controls are correct. Whereas in a bigger museum, you don't usually have to worry about that too much.
All right. And do explorers haunt the Explorers Club? Is it haunted?
Some people say it is haunted. I've never experienced any hauntings or anybody coming to visit me. Although I will say, the very first time I closed the club all by myself, I was closing what the room at the very top of the building, which is called the gallery, and we have one of those weather vanes, and it's a really old weather vane, so it spins around and creaks, and I didn't know that, and so the sound of the creaking comes in from the fireplace in that room, from the chimney in that room, and so I was really scared because it did sound like some type of moaning. But then I called my boss, and of course he did play into it and say that it was the ghost of Matthew Henson, but no. Matthew Henson, for anybody who doesn't know, was the person who discovered the North Pole in 1909. But yeah, so no, I've never met a ghost, which means if there are ghosts, they're probably pretty friendly.
All right, well, we're running out of time here. I want to share all of the links for Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants, for Reach the World, and for the Explorers Club. That's where you can meet more amazing women explorers. Sign up to join any of our programs for any of the general audience out there, any teachers who are out there. We have a lot of resources for you to bring STEM and women in STEM into your classrooms. So please follow us there, get in touch. I would like to thank you guys so much for joining us today and for sharing these stories. It's really important to rewrite history because, history was not always written by women, and so their stories were forgotten. And I have so much respect for everybody's work in this field. So thank you all for joining us today and sharing those stories.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.